All right. Hello.
Hello, we're back. It's good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you again. I'm really excited about catching up and reading through this new article.
This one was fun and interesting, a little different from some of the stuff we've done in the past, although similar to our first episode a little bit, looking at the latent space and kind of trying to understand what's happening under the hood of neural networks when we're jailbreaking them.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that there is a nice connection between that first episode. And I'm really excited to kind of better understand this. This, I think, gives us a better geometric understanding, a visual understanding almost, of what is going on in that latent space and testing some of these hypotheses empirically about the way in which jailbreaks can come about against LLMs.
Yeah, it's fun. And we'll see. There's some good charts in here. Buckle up for you at home. There's some tough notation in this one. We'll get
We'll
there.
break it down.
Um,
All right, so today we are reading Towards Understanding Jailbreak Attacks in LLMs, which is a representation space analysis. And forgive me if authors I mispronounce your names, but thank you so much, Yuping Lin, Pengfei He, Han Shu, Yue Xing, Makoto Yamada, Hui Liu, Jiliang Tang. You guys did really, really thorough, excellent work. All right, so let's take this abstract. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, let's do it. Large language models are susceptible to a type of attack known as jailbreaking, which misleads LLMs to output harmful contents. Although there are diverse jailbreak attack strategies, there is no unified understanding on why some methods succeed and others fail. This paper explores the behavior of harmful and harmless prompts in the LLM's representation space to investigate the intrinsic properties of successful jailbreak attacks. We hypothesize that successful attacks share some similar properties. They are effective in moving the representation of harmful prompts towards the direction of harmless prompts. We leverage hidden representations in the objective of existing jailbreak attacks to move the attacks along the acceptance direction and conduct experiments to validate the above hypothesis using the proposed objective. We hope this study provides new insights into understanding how LLMs understand harmfulness information.
Cool. So we all know, if you're watching, likely you know what jailbreaks are. And so what my takeaway from this abstract is that at a very high level, they are going to plot what it looks like when they have successful jailbreaks and what it looks like when they have not successful jailbreaks, not harmful prompts, really, and understand what is the difference in the representation space, what that might look like visually, and then see whether they're able to make prompts that would be considered harmful to be more like they're harmless. How's that? Is that high level?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Great. So I think we should skip over some of the first part of the introduction. So in this work, we focus on understanding the behavior of jailbreak attacks through the learned representation space of the victims' LLMs. In detail, in our analysis in section 3, we'll get there, we first find that well-aligned LLMs, such as Llama with reinforcement learning from human feedback, can provide clearly separable representations for the harmless and harmful prompts. It suggests that these models can effectively extract the harmful information from the harmful prompts and distinguish them with harmless prompts. More importantly, we further visualize the representations of jailbreak attempts obtained through representative jailbreak attacks like GCG, which is greedy coordinate gradients, I believe. This is a famous paper by Zhu et al., Autodan, and pair. And we talked about a variant of pair last time with the robo pair. We observe an increasing ratio of succeeded jailbreak prompts over failed jailbreak prompts along the direction from the cluster of harmful prompts to the cluster of harmless prompts. This observation indicates that prompts moving in the aforementioned direction toward the cluster of harmless prompts are more effective at deceiving the victim LLMs. Based on these insights, to comprehensively understand the role of harmfulness in jailbreak attempts, we further leveraged the representation in existing attacks by introducing a novel optimization objective to move the representation of the harmful prompts towards the acceptance direction. This new optimization objective can be simply combined with existing white box jailbreak attack methods. We employ our method in GCG and AutoDAN and conduct experiments to study attack success rates brought by this new method compared with corresponding baselines. For example, we achieve an ASR of 62.31% over Llama 2 after enhancing the GCG attack, which was 36% higher than the corresponding baseline. These results further support our understanding of jailbreak attacks.
So what they're saying is they're gonna try these 3 attacks, and mainly they actually end up focusing on GCG and AutoDAN, not so much on pair. And they're gonna try and look at what's going on inside the neural network with regards to when these attacks are successful or not. And they have found, at least for GCG, that what they learn, specifically the directionality of harmfulness, which is similar to what we found in the first paper that we read in the first episode, is useful in enhancing the GCG attack.
Yeah. One thing I did want to know is I think that that's actually quite interesting that the attacks need to be white box jailbreak attacks, right? And I wonder what it is about the model architecture that is necessary in order to augment existing attack methods that are white box.
Yeah, so one of the things that's going on here in this paper is that what we're going to see in a moment is they do forward passes on the network, but in order to understand the internal representations, they need to extract values, forward pass values, outputs of neural network layers in a hidden layer. Not just on the output layer, which would be for LLMs, the output layer is the vocabulary of the neural network, and you're assigning a probability to each token that the neural network knows. Once you're at that output layer, you've really condensed everything the neural network knows about the input sequence into what it thinks the next token should be. They are walking this back one layer in, the final hidden layer of the network, to understand right before the neural network makes its decision, what is its representation of the data? And you need that level of access in order to have that kind of information. If all you have is the output token, all you can know is what the model thinks the next token should be, not about how it's represented and transformed that data from input to the moment right before prediction.
Right. Nice. Cool.
Yeah, let's skim this related works section first on safety alignment of LLMs. The key thing you need to know about safety alignment is that some models do this, some do not. There are 3 main ways of doing safety alignment. There is direct training, supervised fine tuning, or supervised tuning, where you say, here's a prompt that you shouldn't answer, and the prompt already contains, no, I'm not going to tell you how to build a bomb. This is just standard next token prediction style training. The next type is reinforcement learning with human feedback, where humans have taken a bunch of samples of prompts and answers and ranked them as good or bad. You use those ranking informations to train a separate model, a reward model, and then you use that reward model to, in a reinforcement learning loop, further fine-tune the neural network to avoid saying harmful things and encourage saying harmless things. And then finally, the third way is replace those humans in reinforcement learning with human feedback with a neural network from the start. That's called direct policy optimization. Those are the 3 main techniques right now that people use to safety align neural networks. And not all neural networks are safety aligned. In fact, one of the most interesting things when we get to the key chart of this paper is the difference between the latent representations of the llama models, which were all safety fine-tuned, and I think it's the Gemma model, which is not safety fine-tuned at all. Really, really interesting differences in the latent spaces between those 2 types of LLMs. Really cool. Next thing is jailbreak attacks in LLMs. Hopefully, if you're following us, you're familiar with this, but jailbreak attacks are just ways to get around that safety alignment. There's a wide variety of them. Different models have been shown to be susceptible to different kinds of attacks. It's kind of been a game of whack-a-mole where one pops up and you solve it, and then another pops up and you solve it, but sometimes you also regress. Ariel, you were telling me about an attack that worked on early versions of GPT-3, didn't work against GPT-4, and then started working again on GPT-01. So these kind
Yeah,
of regressions happen too.
we see that you may have had an attack that worked really well on an earlier version of a model. Sometimes this even happens within a given model, like a foundation model. I don't know whether you know this. I'm sure you likely do, but many foundation models, let's say we're working with ChatGPT, when we say I'm going into ChatGPT, there's actually a few different versions and they iterate in ChatGPT 3.5, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And so what might have worked well 2 months ago and now all of a sudden isn't working is because they actually released a brand new version of that ChatGPT 4 with all the subsequent fine tunings, optimizations, and refinements that they've done behind the scenes. And so they are actually releasing on a relatively regular cadence these different refinements to their models. And so we may see that there are certain regressions or changes unless there's a very significant change. And even still, we may find that there's a regression back to something that we'd already worked before. So why don't we jump into the really meaty part of this paper, which is the analysis of the representation for jailbreak attacks. So although various jailbreak attack methods have been proposed, it remains unclear when and how an attack can succeed in misleading a model's output. Therefore, the authors aim to analyze the behavior of these jailbreak attacks by visualizing the representations from victim LLMs. Specifically, they investigate the representations of the anchor prompts and different types of jailbreak prompts to explore the answers to the following questions. 1. What is the relationship between harmless and harmful prompts in the representation space of LLMs? And 2. How do succeeded jailbreak attacks manage to mislead the LLM to provide responses to harmful prompts? So these guys have also done a lot of work with mathematics, and so we are just going to give you a warning that there is some heavy notation. We're going to try and break it down. Before the analysis, they provide the necessary notations. They denote the length of tokens as n, of prompt x as n, vocabulary size of n, embedding dimension as d, and the process of the victim model producing. Ooh, so this is a mapping.
Yeah, the process. Okay, don't let your eyes glaze over. I was actually thinking
Right.
about this a lot. It took me a while, but it's not too hard, I don't think. What they are saying is that each is a function, it's a transformation. It takes in a matrix of real numbers that is n by n, where n is the number of tokens and m is the embedding length. That's actually
Exactly.
pretty straightforward. It's a matrix of n by n tokens in the sequence. The embedding length is m. No big deal. And it turns it into the output, which is the embedding dimension D, a matrix just of the embedding dimension D, which they're extracting from the final hidden layer of the neural network, at least as I understand it.
Right. And so what's happening is you start out with this really big space of all of the potential tokens, and then you're condensing it into the embeddings. And then the next function, this G guy, this is when they're talking about PCA. This is the dimensionality reduction. And so all they're saying here is they're taking these embeddings that are still fairly large, these larger matrices, and then they're condensing it into 2 dimensions. And that's what PCA is doing.
Right. So for those of you who work with neural networks all the time, each is simply a forward pass on the neural network, but instead of extracting the actual output value from the output layer, you're extracting a vector from the final hidden layer instead. That's it.
Right. Yep.
And G is just taking that final values hidden layer and performing PCA on it. PCA, very standard dimensionality reduction technique. Really, really common to do.
And it's interesting, like in this particular analysis, they used PCA. They could have also used T-SNE, which is also a fairly common dimensionality reduction for visualizing these, although you lose a little bit of the fidelity of some of the spacing between these clusters that might come out of T-SNE, or you might use UMAP, which does a little bit of a better job to preserve those local minimas and the distances between local minimas as well as global distances, right?
Yeah, I
That I
actually
wouldn't
would be
say.
really curious to see the charts from UMAP and TSNE side by side with these PCA charts. I think that'd be an interesting contribution.
Yeah, yeah, I would be too. But for what we have, PCA still, I think, helps us understand at the very least what's going on. So, the analysis setups. To answer the questions above, we mainly focus on studying popular open source LLMs, including Llama 2 7 billion, Llama 2 13 billion, Llama 3. I actually really appreciate the fact that they used some of these newer models too.
Yep,
Llama B
definitely.
Instruct, Llama 3 Instruct, and Gemma 7 billion. So, following the method of Zhu and Zhang, given each model, we visualize the model's last hidden state of the last input text token as the representation of each prompt. Our focus is primarily on observing the following types of prompts. 1. Harmless anchor prompts. As shown in Table 12, it refers to a dataset containing 100 harmless prompts collected by Zhang et al. The models should accept answering to these prompts, so we denote this dataset as DA. Harmful anchor prompts. This refers to a dataset containing 100 harmful prompts also collected by the same authors, which the model should provide refusals to. And so those are denoted by DR. The important piece to understand from this is that these are collections of harmful prompts and harmless prompts that act as ground truth, so that we know when they say anchor prompts, we need to have some way to orient ourselves in this latent space. Because as we reduce the dimensionality, we no longer are able to say, oh, okay, I know exactly where we stand in this latent space. I mean, we're not high dimensional beings. We can't think in these high dimensional spaces. So instead, they give us easy to navigate towards landmarks so that we can say, this is the general area of harmful, and this is the general area of harmless, right? So that might look like over here, you can see this. The harmful anchor prompts are what we see in this gray, and the harmless anchor prompts are what we see in this blue. And you can see that they live in different sections of this low dimensional representation.
Yeah, and I especially want to call attention to the difference between the first three columns, which are all llama models, and the final column, which are all Gemma models. In the llama model's latent space, there is clear separability between the harmful and harmless prompts, in no small part because these models have been explicitly alignment trained. They have gone through human-led reinforcement learning. They have gone through direct policy optimization. They've been explicitly tuned to distinguish between these types of prompts. Whereas the Gemma models have not, and as a result, there is substantial overlap between where the harmful and harmless prompts fall in the Gemma model's internal representation of the space. A second thing that I think is important to say when we look at these charts is that, and they say this somewhere in the paper, so we'll probably repeat ourselves, but PCA has taken this higher dimensional space and turned it into 2 dimensions. On average, these 2 dimensions only accounted for about 50% of the variance between these points overall. So we are, of course, missing some level of nuance and, the value of high dimensional spaces when we do dimensionality reduction, just always. But this accounts for about 50% of the difference between any given data points in the llama models. And I think it was a little less in the Gemma models, but I might be misremembering.
Right. I think that's a really important piece to call out, because just because this gives us a way to grok and visually interact with these latent spaces, it still does not mean that there aren't other things that may be impacting the harmfulness or harmlessness of any given prompt.
Yeah, and one more kind of important piece is that these data, these charts have been produced specifically from taking prompts that we know fell into just two buckets, harmful and harmless. That's the primary way that we selected these data. If we selected a hugely random sample of data that weren't targeting obviously harmless prompts versus obviously harmful prompts, PCA, these first two dimensions might no longer account for 50% of the variance. They might account for a much smaller portion of the variance. So the difference between these data points is going to be more clear and more capturable when those are the only kinds of data points that go into the prompting, that go into the chart building.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But for the purposes of this experiment, it actually
Very interesting results.
done a very good job of helping create, especially in the llama models, creating these clear landmarks within the latent space for where these live and what their distribution is, what variance is. Anyway, so we also have initial jailbreak prompts. So these are prompts that were collected from the first 100 entries of the adversarial benchmark dataset that Ju published. This is a dataset from which jailbreak attacks were initialized.
And in theory, these should be pretty close to the harmful prompts, because in theory, if we need to jailbreak it to make it answer the question, these should be harmful prompts as well. So when we plot those on the chart, we should expect to see those initial jailbreak prompts be pretty within the distribution of the harmful anchor prompts. If we don't, that would be a big surprising result.
Right. The next category is failed jailbreak prompts, and this refers to the perturbed prompts of failed jailbreak attempts. The model either refuses to assist the harmful request or provides unrelated responses. So we'll go into what exactly it means to perturb the prompt, but this is a failed attempt. And then, likewise, succeeded jailbreak prompts refers to the perturbed prompts of successful jailbreak attempts, which were able to deceive the model into providing helpful on-topic responses to harmful requests. So the choice of harmful and harmless anchor points is crucial for determining how effectively the first two principal components of PCA capture harmfulness information. When the two datasets differ significantly on harmfulness, but remain highly similar in other aspects, such as query formats and text lengths, the harmfulness will be the major source of variation or a major source of variation in the data. And in this case, the first two principal components of PCA will mainly focus on explaining the data variation in terms of harmfulness. I think, as you mentioned earlier, Teb, this is something of an assumption, right? We are kind of assuming, especially, and we'll talk a little bit more about how much variance is captured by these first two components, which serve as our axes in the principal component analysis. But fundamentally, I think it's a reasonable assumption for us to say, yes, broadly speaking, the major things that are being, or at least some major aspect that is being captured here, is the difference between harmfulness and harmlessness.
Right. And, the longer the prompts are, the more complicated they are, the harder it is to do this. But imagine, for example, a harmless prompt, how do I build a fan? And a harmful prompt, how do I build a bomb? One is harmless, one is harmful. There's only a one-word difference between those two phrases, so they're similar in length, they're similar in style, they're very semantically similar. And ideally, what we want the models to have learned is that building a bomb is dangerous, building a fan is harmless, and so the substantial difference between those two phrases will contribute to this separability. And they're similar in every other aspect, therefore, So it's harder to do that with longer and more complicated prompts. I bet if we looked at these anchor prompts, they would all be pretty short, simple prompts so that you can more easily control for this harmfulness being the only difference.
Moving on, we mainly study 3 jailbreak attacks, including white box attacks, GCG and Autodan, and black box attacks, pair. For the ease of further observation and analysis, both GCG and Autodan employ early stopping, termination on success, as their termination criteria to boost the ASR of each method. We also conduct the same experiments without applying early stopping, and the results indicate that the conclusion of this section still holds. Details of the ASR on each attack can be found in Appendix 1, A1. To visualize the representation, we first conduct PCA dimension reduction on the representations of the harmless and harmful anchor datasets, DA union DR, to find the first 2 principal components. They smushed the harmful and harmless prompts together and then said, let's do PCA on them. Then we project each representation vector, as well as the representation of prompts in jailbreak datasets, which are the initial, failed, and succeed, onto the 2D space spanned by these 2 principal components. The visualization result is in figure 1.
Yeah, and this explains in part why it's so important to select these anchor points carefully, because you're performing the PCA on all the subsequent data points exclusively based on the extracted principal components from just the union of the anchor points together. And so those 200 data points really fundamentally control what that PCA visualization space is.
So we'll look at the figures shortly again, but let's just read through observation number 1 and then try and evaluate it.
Yeah, and observation 1 is more or less what we already said, that these harmful and harmless prompts are going to be clearly separable in the well-trained LLMs. So, observation 1, harmful and harmless anchor prompts are separable in well-aligned LLMs. If we only focus on the representations of anchor datasets, harmful and harmless, black and blue, we can find that the representations are well separated between harmful and harmless anchor prompts, especially in LLMs such as Llama 2, Llama 3. It indicates that these models can effectively capture harmful information from the harmful prompts and distinguish them from harmless prompts. In addition to the visualization, the PCA explained variance ratios are 0.46 and 0.04 for the first 2 principal components on Llama 2 7 billion, respectively. This further demonstrates that the 2 dimensions of PCA effectively capture the major variation in the data.
So I think this is something that you were saying before, which is that we're capturing about half of the variance with these first 2 principal components. But one thing that I think is really important to note as well is that we should be paying attention mostly to this first principal component, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is going to effectively be our x-axis, right? So when we look at distributions along the x-axis, it's going to be much more meaningful than when we look at distributions on the y-axis. And so that's something
Right.
just
It
for us to
accounts for
keep in mind. Right.
10 times the variance. The difference between
Exactly.
46% and 4%. Yeah, huge difference.
Exactly.
We also calculate the ratio of between class variance or variation and within class variation of the 2 anchor datasets on Llama 2 7 billion. With the 2 datasets, one can calculate the overall variation among all samples, total variance, and can also calculate the variation within each cluster within class variance, and between all clusters between class variance. A larger between-class variance ratio indicates that the clusters are more separated from each other. The first 2 principal components explained 50.43% of the total variance, among which 85.57% is between-class variation. These values further verify that 1. Harmfulness is a major source of variation in the representation, and 2, the model can differentiate harmful and harmless prompts, and 3, the first 2 principal components are powerful enough to capture the harmfulness of the prompts, and perhaps even the first principal component.
Right. So let's, with that in mind, just peek again at
Yes.
these different figures, because I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we can kind of glean, right? And so the very first thing that we're seeing, I think, is just how much you can see the difference along the llamas, as you were mentioning before. But you really don't see it at all with Gemma, right? We
Right.
are really trying to look effectively just at the x-axis, because this is what's going to be describing most of the variance. And it's all kind of smushed together, right? You can
Yes.
see you've got on the x-axis points all around, and the same thing over here.
Yeah. And the fundamental hypothesis here that they're setting forward is on models that are not alignment tuned, the models don't substantially distinguish between harmful and harmless data points. There isn't a mechanism for them to have learned how to do that, and so they don't. But in the other charts, the llama charts, what you pretty much see in these charts and what would be very indicative of success is the green dots are the initial jailbreak prompts, which we assume ought to be pretty harmful because we're assuming the models are supposed to refuse these prompts. You can see in the first three charts that generally the green dots are right on top of the black dots. They are tightly clustered. There's maybe on the Llama 3 8 billion a little bit of more distinguishment between the black and green dots. They're shifted basically to the left in those charts. Then, failed jailbreak in yellow, what we would expect to see is that failed jailbreak attempts don't successfully shift from the green dot that they originated from towards the blue zone of harmless. They still appear to be harmful in this internal space.
Right.
And then red dots, succeeded jailbreaks, you should see have shifted significantly from their initial zone, the green zone, towards the blue zone. That's what it means to be a succeeded jailbreak in a lot of ways. You took something that the model should have thought was harmful and you moved it towards being harmless. And that is pretty much the pattern that you see in all of these llama charts. There's some caveats, and we can hem and haw and look at sort of like the details, the super fine details, but generally, that's what we see.
Yeah, I'll just point out, there are a few situations here where, especially like on the 13 billion parameter model, we see that there's like almost a smack dab overlap between the failed jailbreak attempts and the succeeded jailbreak attempts in this PCA space, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that would suggest that we're not actually sufficiently capturing the variation between those two groups in order to be able to explain why did jailbreaks succeed in that model versus why did they fail in that model. But we do see them shifted over from where the harmful anchor prompts live in this PCA space. So there is something really interesting in this. It really does show that even within the llama models, we do have like these weird topologies within the latent space that are substantively different one from the other. And so GCG is the top row, pair is the middle, and AutoDan is the bottom. So GCG, these are all optimization-based techniques, right? Where what they are doing is adding this adversarial suffix that is trying to minimize the likelihood that the model will respond with, sorry, I can't help with that. The middle is pair. This is where they're iteratively have another generative AI model try to give feedback in order to make the jailbreak succeed. And then the final one is AutoDan, which is also, it starts on the and like do anything now kind of a template and then iterates on it until it succeeds. But the same is true. Like what is being captured here between these two groups is not really easily captured. in this
Yeah,
PCA
and that might
space.
suggest that in addition to harmful versus harmless, there are other mechanisms that have been fine-tuned into the refusal mechanism of this particular model. So maybe a prompt is not harmful per se, but it's to do with copyright protected material. And they refused it for a different reason. That's been fine-tuned into the networks, but really doesn't appear in this PCA space.
On the other hand, separation between harmful and harmless anchor prompts in Gemma is not as significant as it is in the Llama series models, as you were mentioning. Also, the between class variance ratio and the within class variance ratio of the two anchor datasets are 7% and 92% on Gemma in the whole representation space, further verifying the observation from the visualization that Gemma 7 billion cannot distinguish harmful and harmless prompts, which also aligns with the fact that Gemma B is not explicitly aligned during training. To ease the explanation of observations, we formally define the acceptance direction as follows. And I recognize the fact that this sounds very concerning, but we're going to make this as easy as possible to understand. So, denote the acceptance center, CA, as the center of the PCA reduction representations of harmless anchor prompts, and the refusal center as the center of PCA reduced representations of harmful anchor prompts. Define the acceptance criteria as the direction from CR to CA. So, without going too much into the weeds here, what is happening is that we are trying to look at CA, which is the geometric center of all the harmless prompts, right? And so that gives us that nice white dot over here. And then the same thing is true for the CR. That's this nice white dot over here. And then the last bit is EA. And so that's just the normalized vector that's been normalized to the unit, to be a unit vector. So looks really scary and complicated. Not too bad in the end. Observation 2. Succeeded jailbreak attempts move the harmful prompts towards the direction of harmless prompts, anchor prompts, farther than the failed ones. So now we're going to be focusing just on the red, yellow, and green clusters. So focusing on those jailbreak prompts, especially in the Llama series, we can see that the succeeded jailbreak attacks managed to move the initial prompts toward the harmless anchor prompts. This is something that we had kind of already started to visually identify as we were looking through those figures, but now we're seeing it reported a little bit more. In detail, as evident, especially in certain figures, A, B, I, and J, compared to the failed jailbreak prompts, succeeded jailbreak prompts show a more noticeable movement toward the harmless anchor center. For the other models, we report the numerical results in Table 1. In detail, for each attack under each model, we begin by determining the direction from the harmful anchor prompt to the harmless anchor prompt. We then calculate the projected distance from the center of each type of jailbreak prompt to both types of anchor prompts along this direction. From the results, we can also observe that succeeded attacks move along the direction from the harmful anchor center to the harmless anchor center. Notably, this conclusion is not perfectly consistent in some scenarios of the Gemma 7b model. This is because Gemma 7b is not explicitly aligned and it does not well distinguish harmful and harmless prompts, which is also validated in observation 1. Thus, in Gemma 7b, the succeeded attacks do not necessarily move the samples uniformly to the direction of harmless anchor prompts. So, after having gotten enough context loaded in, let's talk about what exactly are they doing in order to be able to validate whether or not these observations actually hold true. So in this section, we leverage the observations in section 3 to study whether existing jailbreak attacks can achieve a higher ASR by inducing the acceptance direction. For simplicity, we summarize the observations and impose the following hypotheses. Number 1, shifting the representation of a harmful prompt towards the acceptance direction in the PCA reduced space can effectively increase the possibility of jailbreaking the model. Methodology-wise, we develop a method to combine with existing jailbreak attacks. In short, the new method involves two stages, the anchoring process and the optimization objective. The anchoring process anchor the PCA space and determine the acceptance direction in the same way as discussed by section 3. The optimization objective uses this anchored information to formalize the loss function for use in specific attack processes. Our method is orthogonal with existing jailbreak attacks, so it can be applied in existing methods via replacing the optimization objective in the attack implementation. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what is this basically saying? First, they've got this anchoring process. We discussed a lot about what they're doing. And then next, they've got this optimization objective. And so because they have already done this transformation and identified what the direction is that they should be moving in for this PCA, they're able to then leverage that as an optimization to say, if you add another token, does this move it further in that direction?
Yeah, and one thing that I think is really interesting about this, I want to make a connection to the first paper we read together, where in the first paper we read together, they didn't do any of this PCA, but they did extract in the full dimensional space their notion of, on average, what the direction of harmfulness was. And then they, in that paper, they directly injected that directionality into the LLM. So they said, compute the vector you normally would have, we'll move that vector in the direction of harmfulness directly, and then continue the forward pass. In this attack, they're saying, instead of injecting that direction directly, we're going to iteratively optimize GCG to target that directionality, rather than target what it does in the original implementation of GCG. So GCG was already optimization driven. It optimized for one thing. They're saying, instead of optimizing for that, we're going to optimize for the direction, maximizing the difference between the harmlessness center. We're going to try and make that as big as possible.
Right. So the optimization objective. In the proposed method following hypothesis 1, the attack aims to maximize the projected distance from the start point of the prompt in the PCA space along the acceptance direction.
Yeah, they are trying to maximize this thing, fancy L. I don't know what Greek character that probably is. But again, it looks like it's a lot, but it's not too much. Inside the brackets, on the left, you have g of h of x, which is, again, the PCA dimensionality reduction of the forward pass of the current prompt, minus the PCA of the forward pass of the initial prompt. And then they're saying that result is a matrix projected to the acceptance direction, right? So take all of that information and find out in the acceptance direction how far those two, what's the difference between those two prompts. Try to maximize that.
Totally. So by optimizing the above loss function, we move the representation of a prompt toward the acceptance direction in the anchored PCA space, which is the same space we define in section 3, and increase the possibility of the model accepting it, which is producing an affirmative response to the prompt. This objective can be optimized by methods proposed by existing jailbreak attacks, such as GCG and AutoDAN. Thus, we integrate our objective with their optimization algorithms, and more details are given in section 5. Note that these optimization algorithms work in different manners, so our proposed method may exhibit different phenomena. In general, if an algorithm can successfully optimize the objective, then our proposed method is expected to lead to a better performance. I think we can skip over early stopping. I think it is more of an implementation detail, but the long and short of it is that stopping early might have helped with performance, but it didn't really change the overall picture of it.
Yeah.
So why don't we skip straight to the experiment?
So in this section, we integrate our proposed optimization objective with the existing jailbreak attacks and conduct experiments to evaluate their performance. The proposed optimization objective in equation 1 requires access to internal parameters of the victim model and therefore can only be used in white box jailbreak attacks. We use two common jailbreak attacks, GCG and Autodan, in the experiments, and we denote ours with GCG plus ours and Autodan plus ours. The baselines. Our method is compared against several baselines: clean input, baseline GCG, baseline Autodan, and manual jailbreak by applying a Dan template, which is the latest to date of this writing, detailed in Appendix G. GCG aims to find an adversarial suffix to maximize the probability that the victim model produces a specified affirmative string. Sure, here is. Autodan generates stealthy jailbreak prompts by a genetic algorithm and utilizing handcrafted jailbreak prompts. A detailed description of experiment settings is in Appendix B1. So I think this is a good thing to just make sure we're more clear on. The initial objective function is maximizing the similarity between the phrase being produced by the LLM and the phrase yes or sure or some target that they typically in those prompts ask the model to say. The prompt has some stuff and says, start your response with, sure, I'll tell you how to build a bomb, basically. And so they're targeting that specific phrase that they're asking the model to say. Whereas in these new experiments, instead of targeting that, they're targeting that the outputs have moved in the acceptance direction that they previously defined.
Right. I think it's also worth noting here that these are two different, in some ways, fundamentally different algorithms. GCG really is trying to do a gradient descent optimization where it is seeing what additional word will lead to this sure here is type of a response. Whereas Autodan, it starts with some kind of an initial prompt template, and it has genetic mutations, right? It's a genetic algorithm, and so there's some element of randomness. It's not necessarily being directed to maximize or minimize a particular loss function. And as a result, they are working somewhat differently.
Right. It's much harder to direct the changes that the genetic algorithm makes along some direction in the space. Whereas with something like gradient descent models, optimization mechanisms, you are explicitly making a directional change. And we'll see that the difference matters in this case. So
Right.
let's go ahead with data sets and models. During the anchoring process, following the setups in section 3, the two anchor data sets contain 100 prompts each. And the differences between the two datasets are primarily controlled to focus on harmfulness. In the optimization stage, the target dataset we use in the experiment consists of all 520 prompts from AdVench. The target models are Llama 2 7 billion, Llama 2 13 billion, Llama 3 8 billion, Vicuna 7 billion, and Gemma 7 billion. In addition, we take that the first 100 results from attacking Llama 2 7 billion apply two existing defense methods, perplexity filter and paraphrasing, and study how ASR is changed. Finally, to study transferability of the proposed method, we use the first 100 attack results from Llama 2 7 billion as the basis to transfer to 4 white box models and 2 black box models. Llama 2 7 billion, Llama 3 8 billion, Vicuna 7 billion, Gemma 7 billion, GPT 3.5 Turbo, and GPT 40125 Preview. The evaluator we use is the LLM classifier judge proposed by Mazika et al. We let the victim model generate 512 tokens as suggested by Mazika et al. And then evaluate the jailbreak with the classifier by applying the judge template described in Appendix H. This performance of each attack is reported in ASR. We apply the same termination criteria, see the early stopping stuff that we skipped, to both baseline methods and ours.
Great. So let's look at the actual experiment results. So we conduct experiments to compare the ASR of our proposed method and existing methods, and the results are summarized in Table 2. So in particular, they're highlighting that the GCG plus hours, right? So that's where they added their own optimization technique instead, generally shows significant improvement in ASR. Right here, you can see across the board, they really did a great job. Of course, Vicuna just completely susceptible to
Highly targetable.
they almost stopped, like they almost ignored it for the entire paper because it's just like so susceptible to these jailbreak attacks.
It is kind of funny that GCG plus Rs is worse on Vicuna, perhaps in part because it's already so susceptible that it's basically just a little bit of random chance that is the difference between whether or not it's jailbroken. But I do think that's funny. The model that is most generally jailbreakable, about 1 percentage point less jailbreakable by this new technique. I just think that's kind of funny.
Sure. It feels to me like it's on the margin, but absolutely.
Yeah, no, probably not statistically significant.
Right. That having been said, it looks like there's actually mixed success here, right? Like on Llama 2's 13 billion, they actually perform worse with the optimization than Autodan.
Mm-hmm.
But it experiences a significant decline on Gemma B 7 billion, right? So really significant in the unaligned model, where it really doesn't do nearly as well.
Yeah, and
And
the difference in success between GCG and Autodan, we've kind of already hinted around this, but it's very significant, and in part because GCG is fundamentally an optimization method, and it turns out, much easier using the GCD methodology to walk these data points towards the desired objective function that they defined earlier in this paper, towards the acceptance direction, right? And with Autodan, it seems it's really not very amenable to intentionally moving the data points in this acceptance direction. It doesn't seem very effective at that.
I will also note, I think it's worth paying attention to the fact that despite what we just discussed, that the absolute value of how successful these attacks were of Autodan versus GCG are quite striking, right? And so the genetic algorithm is much less successful on average
In general.
in general. And so there is something really powerful about this GCG optimization technique, and even more powerful when you supercharge it with this optimization booster, if you will.
Picture takeaway, calculus still rules.
Always. So from the results, one can see our method exhibit differences in the performance when applied to GCG and Autodan. To explain the effectiveness for both GCG and GCG plus hours, the objective smoothly decreases in the optimization, and the trajectory of the attack smoothly moves from the initialization to the endpoint. As a result, the additional loss considered in our method can be fully utilized during the optimization to move the attack along the acceptance direction. On the other hand, for Autodan, both the learning curve and the attack trajectory implies that this is a volatile optimization method, and the success of Autodan heavily relies on the random search in the genetic algorithm used in this attack instead of minimizing the objective. Therefore, our proposed objective may not be as effective as in GCG. So I think this is a really interesting takeaway, that genetic algorithms can be really powerful and don't behave in the way that we would expect these optimizations to work with the gradient descent. So it's much easier to basically create a more powerful gradient descent attack if you're already basing your initial attack on gradient descent.
Right, and we both thought this was pretty interesting, so I think we're going to do a follow-up episode where we read the GCG and Dan papers and then revisit this result and explain why the AutoDan methodology isn't really amenable to this optimization technique, why this new objective function doesn't really seem to work well with AutoDan. I think that's going to be a really fun episode. The last thing we should do for this section is look at these charts at the top of the next page and just see their visualizations. These are the same variety of visualizations that we already showed at the top, but just comparing the hours version with the standard version.
Right. Great. The next section is really testing this by putting it through defenses. And again, like I think that what we're going to be seeing is just how effective this optimization technique works for optimization specific defenses and for paraphrasing. So, in a nutshell, perplexity filter is one defense method that was proposed by Jane et al. That is based off of an observation that the token level optimization methods, so GCG, will append a string to the original prompt that typically generate unreadable gibberish strings with a perplexity much higher than that of regular human text. So the method evaluates the unreadability of strings by assessing the model's output perplexity toward that target string, and if that perplexity exceeds a given threshold, the model is considered to be under attack.
Let's pin there before we do paraphrasing. Just for anyone who's not familiar with perplexity, it's basically a measure of the model's confidence in its outputs. So if you look at that final layer, which is the vocabulary of the LLM, if there's one token there that has like 99.9% probability and the rest are all obviously very small probabilities, then the perplexity score is very low. And on the other hand, if you had 100 values all with 1% probability, the model's not confident in any one of its predictions, and perplexity will be very high. So when the model is really confused about what the next token should be, the perplexity score is really high. This is a super easy filter to add to your LLMs, a very easy kind of way to filter out certain of these attack types. If the model's confused, then don't answer it. It's probably gibberish text. You're probably under attack.
Right. Paraphrasing, on the other hand, involves using an LLM to rephrase the user's prompt before its input into the victim model, making the adversarial text ineffective while still largely preserving the original semantics. So why don't we just skip to table 5, and we can see that the perplexity filter really helped for GCG plus the GCG with that additional optimization. And so it filtered out 99% and 98% respectively of the jailbreak attempts. On AutoDan, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, which again, I think kind of makes sense, right? AutoDan, we mentioned, is a genetic algorithm. It randomly searches for these mutations, and as a result, it's creating the effective jailbreaks based off of the randomness. So the model may or may not be confused as to what should be the next word.
Well, and in fact, these results suggest that the prompts produced by AutoDan don't really make the model perplexed. The filter rate is 0. So
Exactly.
very rarely, no times, does AutoDan produce these kinds of prompts that make the model really unconfident, make it really perplexed. Whereas with GCG, you're frequently doing that, which makes sense because GCG appends oftentimes like literally total gibberish to the end of a prompt in order to get it out of distribution and therefore break the machine.
Right. Paraphrasing, on the other hand, seemed to work really well across the board. However, one thing to caution with paraphrasing is that while it can be a very effective defense, it can also potentially reduce the information that you pass such that you may break the functionality you are seeking to create.
And it's also a little bit more expensive because you're basically doing 2 forward passes per prompt now. You take the prompt, the first forward pass is, hey, paraphrase this prompt. Then you take that paraphrase prompt and say, hey, answer this question.
I think the last thing that's worthwhile to touch on is the transferability. So, as part of a comprehensive evaluation of our method, we also present the results of a transfer attack. So, what this means is that they tried using the attack from one model in a different model. So, our proposed method does not help enhance the transferability of the original methods. As mentioned in section 5.3, we conjecture that different models understand harmfulness in different ways, which may be caused by the distinct architectural designs, training data, and training methods. This means that the acceptance direction calculated on different models does not transfer well. Our proposed method, compared to classical text-based approaches, requires information that is more specific to each model and thus may show worse results in attacks. Nonetheless, our results still bring more insights on how to balance the representation and transferability when designing jailbreak attacks.
Yeah, and this is a result that, on the one hand, I don't think is terribly surprising necessarily, but I do think is really valuable, and collecting more evidence that it's true should help us understand these models better. Unfortunately, what it basically means to me is the internal representation space of each of these individual models is substantially different. And understanding, like, let's say you had a perfect understanding somehow, you're a high dimensional being, and you had a perfect understanding of how Llama 2, 7 billion, thinks, and what those vectors at the end of the hidden space mean, you would still not understand anything about Llama 3's thinking. And I don't know, that's going to continue to give us problems when we try and understand these models, because everything we learn about a particular model, it may not transfer at all to the next model in terms of what any of the directions in this high dimensional space are and what they mean.
Yeah, I think it would be really cool to see whether we can wrap this up and summarize, because this has been a really meaty article, in addition to the fact that it introduced at times some scary looking notation. I think it also required a lot of setup for us to be able to break apart the main claim. And to me, the main claim here is that, especially on aligned models, there tends to be a difference between the area in the latent space where harmfulness lives. There's some kind of a direction that represents harmfulness versus harmlessness. Although in unaligned models, that direction is much less clear. And based off of this insight, you are able to further optimize, specifically optimization-based attacks like GCG, in order to increase your success rate in aligned models as well as unaligned models. However, perplexity filters tend to significantly reduce the effectiveness of these types of optimization-based techniques.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. And then my second big picture takeaway is the thing that we just said, which is every model, and probably even this means every individual architecture with a different set of training data, every produced model, the result of training, are going to have potentially fundamental differences in what the internal representations mean.
Yeah, and to zoom out even further, this is one of the reasons why it is so important to be able to say, even if my product is powered by AI, there is a certain level of security around just making sure that what model you are using is kept relatively secret. You don't want to be exposing that to the world writ
Sure.
large, because that could have implications for an adversary to then adjust how they're trying to attack your model.
Sweet. So we're going to review this content again in a future episode where we look at GCG and AutoDan and try and help you all understand why this attack was so much more effective, or in augmenting GCG versus augmenting AutoDan. And we'll see you then.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure. I'll see you next time.